René Descartes, the father of modern philosophy, conceived that the human person as having a body and a mind. In his famous treatise, The Meditation of First Philosophy, Descartes claims that there is so much that we should doubt. In fact, he says that much of what we think and believe, because they are not infallible, may turn out to be false. One should only believe that which can surpass or pass the test of doubt. Descartes 2008. If something is so clear and lucid as not to be even doubted, then that is the only time one should actually buy a proposition. In the end, Descartes thought that the only thing that one cannot doubt is the existence of the self. For even if one doubts oneself, that only proves that there is a doubting self, a thing that thinks, and therefore that cannot be doubted. So Descartes is having now to introduce now in terms of the belief or understanding of the self. That means that when we try to think or to buy a certain proposition, then it must actually pass the so-called the test of doubt. The test of doubt means that if we cannot doubt or a thing may be clearly be explained or clearly be understood, then it can pass the test of doubt. Therefore, one can say that is already the truth. Such in the case of self. For instance, we will try to deny self, then other than denying it, then it only actually proves in a sense that there is still a self. So did you get me? So when you say deny the self, still there is a self because there is the denying self. So that is what Rene Descartes wanted to tell us. Thus his famous cogito ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am, the fact that one thinks should lead one to conclude without a trace of doubt that he exists. The self then for Descartes is also a combination of two distinct entities, the cogito or the thing that thinks, which is the mind, and the extensa or extension of the mind, which is the body. In Descartes' view, the body is nothing else but the machine that is attached to the mind. The human person has it, but it is not what makes a man. If at all, that is the mind. Descartes says, but what then am I? A thinking thing, it has been said. But what is a thinking thing? It is a thing that doubts, understands or conceives, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, that imagines also, and perceives. So here, when we try to go back to his famous maxim, which is cogito ergo sum, which is translated as I think, therefore I am. So here, he wanted to tell us also that we cannot actually trace a test of doubt on the existence of ourselves because we can still think that there is a self. Therefore, there is really the existence of self. We cannot deny that fact. He also added that the self is a combination of two distinct entities. These are cogito, or a thing that thinks, which is the mind, and the other one is the body. So still, in relation to what Aristotle believed, there is still the dualistic Aristotle, I should say. We have Plato and Socrates. They believe that there is still the dualistic nature of self. But he again said that what then is a thinking self? A thinking self is a thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses, that imagines also, and perceives. So as you actually observe, uh, when a particular philosopher, any particular person or scientist wanted to expound the idea of the other, there is something that's so-called the expansion of ideas. He wanted to expand that idea therefore, what makes it as his own modification of the other's idea. David Hume, a Scottish philosopher, has a very unique way of looking at man as an empiricist who believes that one can only know what comes from the senses and experience. Hume argues that self is nothing like what his predecessors thought of it. The self is only an entity over and beyond the physical body. One can rightly see here the empiricism that runs through his veins. So in this particular slide, it tells us now about David Hume. He is actually an empiricist who believes that one can only know what comes from the senses and experience. He only wanted to tell us that senses and perception plays a vital role in understanding the nature of self. Empiricism is the school of thought that espouses the idea that knowledge can only be possible if it is sense and experience. Man can only attain knowledge by experiencing, that is. To David Hume, the self is nothing else but a bundle of impressions. What then are impressions? For him, if one tries to examine his experiences, he finds that they can all be categorized into two: impressions and ideas. Impressions are the basic object of our experience or sensation. They therefore form the core of our thoughts. When one touches an ice cube, for example, the cold sensation is an impression. Impressions therefore are vivid because they are products of our direct experiences with the world. Ideas, on the other hand, are copies of impressions. So, as we all know now, that empiricism is a school of thought that espouses the idea that knowledge can only be possible if it's sense and experiences. That is, when we try to think of a certain person, or in this case, the self, it must then be explained as it is sense and experience. So, for David Hume, the self is nothing else but a bundle of impressions. So impression includes the something that is now being sensed, and ideas now are simply the copies of impressions. Because of this, they are not as lively and vivid as our impressions. When one imagines the feeling of being in love for the first time, that is still an idea. What is self then? Self, according to Hume, is simply a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity, and are in perpetual flux and movement. Men simply want to believe that there is a unified, coherent self or soul or mind is just like what the previous philosophers thought. In reality, what one thinks as a unified self is simply a combination of all experiences with a particular person. Kant. Thinking of the self as a mere combination of impressions was problematic for Immanuel Kant. Kant recognizes the veracity in Hume's account that everything starts with perception and sensation of impressions. However, Kant thinks that the things that men perceive around them are not just randomly infused into the human person without an organizing principle that regulates the relationship of all these impressions. For Kant, there is necessarily a mind that organizes the impressions that men get from the external world. Time and space, for example, are ideas that one cannot find in the world but still in our minds. Kant called this the apparatus of the mind. So here it is very interesting now that Hume, as contradicting, of course, the idea of the former philosophers, has also been contradicted by Kant in the sense that Kant do not actually believe or has a problematic perception of the understanding of self, because according to, as contrasted to the belief of Hume, that the self is merely a combination of impressions, this is now being rebut by Kant, that one cannot really, although he actually recognizes or believes in the truthfulness of Hume's account that everything starts with perception and sensation of impression. However, there's still a problem because, for example, when we try to think of time and space, which are actually idea as being considered by Hume, still it is still considered as ideas which are also built in our minds. So Kant called this the apparatus of the mind. Along with the different apparatus of the mind goes the self. Without self, one cannot organize the different impressions one gets in relation to his own existence. Kant therefore suggests that self is an actively engaged intelligence of a man that synthesizes all knowledge and experience. Thus, the self is not just what gives one his personality, it is also the seat of knowledge acquisition for all human persons. So, Kant now, as contrasted to Hume, believes that self serves just like a vessel wherein, or apparatus, or a medium, wherein it tries now to consider now the collection of all knowledge, or in this case of Hume's, collection of all impression and ideas of a person. He's the one that synthesizes all of that. Therefore, self is still an actively engaged intelligence.